It was a crisp morning when the small village stirred to life, the sun casting its first light over the old, stone buildings. The air was thick with the scent of earth, and the gentle hum of the wind whispered through the narrow, dust-covered streets. For the villagers, today was supposed to be just like any other. The children would go to school, the elders would gather by the village square, and life would move on in its slow, predictable rhythm. But as the sun climbed higher, something shifted. A sense of unease began to creep through the village, though no one could place its origin. At the heart of the village, nestled between humble homes and the old oak tree, stood a small schoolhouse, a modest building that housed both the youngest and oldest of the village's children. Inside, a new teacher had recently arrived. He was a man in his early 30s, quiet and reserved. His name was Amir, and in the few months he had spent in the village, he had earned the trust of both parents and students alike. Despite his calm demeanor, there was something about Amir that set him apart. He wasn't like the other teachers. He was patient, observant, and somewhat mysterious. While the other teachers in the village had long become part of the fabric of daily life, Amir had remained an outsider, always just a bit apart. People wondered about him. Where had he come from? What brought him to this remote village? But Amir never spoke of his past. He focused on the children, on his lessons, and kept his life to himself. On that particular morning, the school bell rang sharply through the air, signaling the start of the day. The children, excited to begin their lessons, filed into the classroom, chattering amongst themselves. They had no idea that the events of this day would change their lives forever. Amir, as always, stood at the front, preparing his lesson plan. His chalk scratched across the blackboard as he wrote down the day's subject, mathematics, a simple enough task. The children settled into their seats, some eager to learn, others half-heartedly flipping through their books. "Good morning, class," Amir said, his voice calm and even. The students replied in unison, their voices young and bright. But something about Amir was different today. His usual serenity was gone, replaced with an intensity that was palpable. As he began speaking, the words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and full of something unspoken. "We are going to try something different today," he announced, his gaze sweeping over the room, making eye contact with each student. "I want you to listen carefully and think about your actions, not just your words." The class grew quiet, the children shifting in their seats. This wasn't the usual opening of a lesson. Amir was known for being a teacher who kept things light, but today there was an edge to his tone, something that made the children pause. He placed the chalk down with a deliberate motion and turned to face the class fully. The room felt suddenly colder. The windows rattled slightly with the wind, but no one moved. "I know what you've done," Amir said, his voice low and controlled. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, settling over the class in an instant. Every child froze. They exchanged confused glances, not understanding what he meant. Some shifted in their seats, feeling a strange unease settle in their stomachs. "I know everything," Amir continued, his voice steady but unyielding. "I know what you've kept hidden from the world. What you buried deep inside." The words struck the room like a bolt of lightning. Fear spread across the faces of the children. A few of them started to whisper, their voices barely audible. But Amir wasn't finished. He turned slowly, walking toward the chalkboard. His hand hovered over the surface as if he were weighing something in his mind. Then, he began to write. "I know what you've done." The letters appeared in stark contrast to the black surface, bold and sharp. It wasn't a lesson, nor was it a statement one would expect from a teacher. There was no math, no science, no history. Just these words. Simple yet powerful. Amir turned back to face the students, his eyes scanning each one, locking with them for a brief moment before moving on to the next. The room was silent except for the sound of Amir's steady breathing and the occasional rustling of clothing as students nervously shifted in their seats. "What does he mean?" whispered one of the girls, her voice trembling. "I don't know," said another, her face pale. The tension in the room thickened, and it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in. The students shifted uncomfortably, some of them casting furtive glances at their friends, as if hoping someone could explain what was happening. Amir took a deep breath, then spoke again, his voice colder than before. "I've been watching. Listening. You all think no one knows the secrets you carry. The things you've done in the darkness. But I know." He paused. "The village knows." The room erupted into a flurry of whispers, some students looking around in panic, others frozen in place, staring wide-eyed at their teacher. They had always seen Amir as kind, reserved, someone they could trust. But now, he seemed like a stranger, someone they couldn't recognize. Amir slowly made his way to the door, then turned to face the class one last time. "You think you've gotten away with it, but you haven't," he said softly, his voice carrying an ominous weight. "Today, the truth will come out." With that, he stepped out of the classroom, leaving the students in stunned silence. The children sat there, unable to move. They could hear the faint hum of the wind outside, the rustling of leaves, but inside the room, time seemed to have stopped. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. As the minutes ticked by, the gravity of what had just happened began to sink in. What had Amir meant? What truth was he talking about? What did he know? And how could he possibly know it? But more importantly, who was he really? This wasn't the same teacher they had known for the past few months. This was someone different, someone with power, with knowledge, and with an undeniable sense of purpose. The bell rang again, signaling the end of the lesson, but the children didn't move. They couldn't. They were frozen in place, each of them lost in their own thoughts, trying to piece together what had just unfolded. No one dared to leave the classroom, not yet. No one could face the world outside just yet. The village, too, would soon be affected. What had seemed like a peaceful, idyllic place was about to be torn apart by secrets that had long been hidden. The villagers had lived with their own truths buried deep, hoping they would never surface. But Amir had just opened a door, one that couldn't be closed again. As the students slowly began to file out of the room, there was a sense of foreboding that followed them. They were no longer just children, they were part of something much larger. Something much darker. And the truth was coming. It was inevitable. The teacher had spoken. The village would never be the same. The village was buzzing with whispers, an undercurrent of fear that no one could ignore. What had happened in the schoolhouse that morning? The children who had witnessed the teacher's strange outburst walked slowly, eyes downcast, unsure how to speak of it. No one dared to ask too many questions, for fear of what the answers might reveal. Amir's words, "I know what you've done," echoed in the minds of every villager, leaving them paralyzed with dread. What could he possibly know? The villagers had long kept their secrets buried, believing that life in the quiet, remote village would shield them from the consequences of their actions. But now, it seemed, that shield was shattered. For weeks, the tension had been building. It wasn't just the teacher's cryptic statement that had stirred the village. It was the series of strange events that had occurred recently, odd disappearances, unexplainable occurrences, and whispered rumors about things that happened in the dead of night. No one knew what to make of it, but the whispers were persistent. The village had always been a place of quiet comfort, but now it was something else entirely, a pressure cooker, on the verge of exploding. The day after the classroom incident, Amir did not return to school. His absence sent shockwaves through the village. The children who had once adored him now found themselves staring nervously at every stranger who passed by, wondering if they were being watched. Fear had seeped into their bones. It was clear that something was terribly wrong. The parents of the students, too, grew restless. They gathered in the village square, trying to make sense of the situation. No one had heard from Amir, and no one seemed to know where he had gone. Some speculated that he had fled in fear, unable to face the consequences of his words. Others whispered that he had simply gone mad. But there were a few who feared that Amir had merely begun something much bigger, something they were not prepared to handle. Among them was Fatima, a woman who had lived in the village for most of her life. Fatima knew the villagers better than anyone. She was one of the few who had seen the darker side of their lives, the things they tried to keep hidden behind closed doors. Fatima was also one of the few who had grown suspicious of Amir. While others believed him to be a kind and noble teacher, Fatima saw things differently. She had watched him closely ever since he arrived, and she had noticed something unsettling. Amir was not like other teachers. There was a quiet intensity about him, a coldness beneath the surface that no one seemed to notice. Fatima had been at the village square when Amir's strange words had echoed through the air, and she had felt a shiver run down her spine. It was as though the teacher had been speaking directly to her, warning her that her own hidden secrets were about to be exposed. As the days passed, the sense of unease only grew. Amir was still missing, but the villagers couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there somewhere, watching them. It was as if he knew everything they had done, everything they had hidden, and it was only a matter of time before he made them face the truth. One afternoon, after several days of silence, Fatima received an unexpected visitor. It was Amir. He stood at her doorstep, his face pale but determined. His eyes were intense, but there was something almost familiar about the way he looked at her. As though he had known her all her life, as though he had seen right through her. "I need your help," Amir said, his voice low and urgent. "I know you have the answers." Fatima's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this. In fact, she had been waiting for it. She had known this day would come, the day when the past would rise to the surface, and everything would come crashing down. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with fear. Amir's eyes never left hers. "The village is hiding something. There's something they don't want anyone to know. Something that happened a long time ago." Fatima's mind raced. She had heard rumors, but she had never believed them. The village had always been a place of peace, or so she thought. But Amir's words, combined with the strange occurrences that had been happening lately, made her realize that there was something darker at play here. "Do you know what it is?" Amir asked, stepping closer, his voice almost a whisper. "Do you know what the villagers are hiding?" Fatima hesitated. She wanted to lie. To deny everything. But deep down, she knew she couldn't. The truth was more dangerous than she could have imagined, and it was starting to unravel before her eyes. "There was a fire," Fatima said finally, her voice barely audible. "A long time ago. It destroyed part of the village, and many people died. It was kept quiet. People said it was an accident. But I don't believe it was." Amir nodded slowly, as if he had known all along. "What happened after the fire?" he asked. Fatima looked down, as though ashamed. "Some of the survivors, they didn't want anyone to know the truth. They said the fire was caused by a group of outsiders, strangers who came to the village looking for something. But the real cause was something much darker." Amir's gaze sharpened. "What was it? What did they hide?" Fatima took a deep breath, the weight of the secret pressing down on her. It was an act of betrayal. One of the villagers had made a deal with the outsiders. They promised to help the village prosper, but in exchange, they wanted something in return. A sacrifice. Amir stepped back, his face growing pale. "A sacrifice?" he repeated, his voice shaking. Fatima nodded. "Yes. A child. They offered one of our own to the outsiders. And when the villagers found out, they tried to stop it. But it was too late. The fire was set to cover up the truth." Amir stood there, his mind racing. The fire. The sacrifice. The villagers had been hiding the truth for years, trying to bury it beneath layers of lies and silence. But now, the past was catching up with them. "I need to find the person who made that deal," Amir said, his voice steady. "They are the key to everything." Fatima's eyes widened. "You don't understand. That person, they're still here. They never left the village. They're among us." Amir's heart skipped a beat. The truth was closer than he had imagined. He needed to act quickly. If he could find this person, he could uncover everything. The village's darkest secrets would finally be exposed. But there was one problem: the villagers were not ready to face the truth. They had buried it for so long that they would do anything to keep it hidden. Amir knew he was walking a dangerous path, one that could destroy everything. The next few days were a blur of searching, questioning, and watching. Amir kept his eyes open, his every move calculated. He knew the village like the back of his hand, but this was different. This was not about teaching. It was about survival. And he wasn't sure if he would make it out alive. The villagers had no idea what was coming. They thought the truth would remain hidden forever, that the past would never catch up with them. But Amir was determined to expose it all. The days following Amir's discovery of the village's hidden past were a blur of sleepless nights and tense moments. The more he searched, the more he uncovered fragments of a story no one had dared to tell. The villagers, who had once welcomed him with open arms, now regarded him with suspicion. They whispered behind his back, and every glance he received felt like an accusation. Amir's discovery of the fire, the sacrifice, and the deal made with outsiders had shaken him to his core. But it wasn't enough. The real question still loomed: who was the person who had made that deal? Who was the traitor, the one who had put the lives of the entire village at risk? Each night, Amir sat alone in his small room at the village inn, poring over the documents and notes he had gathered. His mind raced as he tried to connect the dots. He knew that the person responsible for the village's darkest secret was still among them. The silence of the villagers spoke volumes. No one wanted to remember what had happened, and no one was willing to talk. But Amir couldn't stop now. He had come too far. The next morning, Amir set out for the village square, where he knew the elders would gather. It was a place where secrets were whispered, where the weight of history hung heavy in the air. The elders were the ones who had lived through the fire and who had carried its burden for so many years. They were the keepers of the village's past, and if anyone knew the truth, it was them. As he walked through the square, Amir noticed the familiar faces of the villagers. Some nodded at him politely, others avoided his gaze altogether. It seemed that every person in the village had a secret now, a secret that was tied to that fire. Fatima had warned him that the person he sought was someone close to the heart of the village. She had hinted that the traitor was someone who held power, someone with influence. But that only made Amir's task more difficult. The elders, after all, were the ones who had been in power when the deal with the outsiders had been struck. If the traitor was one of them, uncovering the truth would be nearly impossible. Amir approached the group of elders, who were gathered beneath a large oak tree in the center of the square. They sat in a circle, speaking in hushed tones, their faces weathered and tired. The weight of years was evident in their every movement, and Amir could see the deep scars of regret etched into their expressions. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach them. He had always respected the elders, but today he felt a growing sense of distrust. There was something in the air, something unsaid, that made him feel like an outsider in his own village. Clearing his throat, Amir stepped forward. The elders looked up, their gazes hardening as they saw him. It was clear that his presence was unwelcome. "What brings you here, Amir?" one of the elders, an older man named Ibrahim, asked. His voice was gruff, as though he had been expecting this moment for some time. "I need to know the truth," Amir said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "I need to know what really happened during the fire." A heavy silence settled over the group. The elders exchanged glances, as if debating whether to speak or to remain silent. Amir's heart raced. He knew that this moment would either break the mystery wide open or bury it forever. "You have no idea what you're asking for," another elder, Zainab, said softly. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were defiant. "The past is something we've left behind, Amir. There's nothing to gain from reopening those wounds." But Amir wasn't ready to give up. He had come too far, and the truth was too important. "I don't care about the past," he said firmly. "I care about the future of this village. The truth will come out eventually. It's better that we face it now than live in fear forever." Zainab's eyes softened for a moment, but the others remained unmoved. They knew that if they spoke, the consequences would be dire. The village's fragile peace would be shattered, and the people would be forced to confront a past they had tried to forget. Ibrahim, Amir said, turning to the oldest of the elders. You were there. You remember what happened. Ibrahim's expression hardened. I remember nothing. And I suggest you forget, too. But Amir wasn't about to back down. He knew that Ibrahim knew more than he was letting on. He had seen it in his eyes, the flicker of guilt, the shadow of a memory that refused to die. Amir pressed on. Tell me, Ibrahim. Who made the deal with the outsiders? Who offered up one of our own as a sacrifice? He asked, his voice low but filled with urgency. For a moment, Ibrahim said nothing. The weight of the question seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. Then, finally, he spoke. It wasn't one person, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was many of us. We were desperate. The village was dying. The crops had failed, the rains had stopped, and we were on the brink of starvation. We made a pact with the outsiders, thinking it would save us. But we were wrong. Amir's heart raced. So it was true. They wanted a sacrifice. Ibrahim nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret. Yes. They wanted a child. One of our own. We thought it was the only way. The outsiders promised us prosperity, but at a terrible cost. And we paid that price. The rest of the elders remained silent, their faces betraying no emotion. But Amir could see the weight of their guilt, the burden they had carried for so long. Who was the child? Amir asked, his voice trembling with the gravity of the question. Ibrahim hesitated, then spoke the name that would forever haunt the village. It was Ahmed. He was only 5 years old. Amir's breath caught in his throat. He had heard stories about Ahmed, stories of the child who had vanished without a trace. But hearing the truth from Ibrahim's lips was something else entirely. The village had never spoken of Ahmed's disappearance, and the elders had always claimed that the child had simply run away. But now, Amir knew the terrible truth. And the fire? Amir asked, barely able to speak. What happened with the fire? Ibrahim's eyes grew dark. The fire was meant to cover up the truth. To destroy the evidence of what we had done. But it got out of control. The flames spread faster than we anticipated, and in the end, we lost everything. The village was never the same after that. Amir stood there, shocked by the revelation. The village had been built on lies, on a terrible sacrifice that had haunted them all for years. The fire that had taken so much from them had also hidden their darkest secret. And now, that secret was finally coming to light. But the truth came at a cost. Amir could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. The village would never be the same again. The people would never be able to look at each other the same way. I'm going to tell them, Amir said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. The people deserve to know the truth. Ibrahim's face darkened. You don't understand, Amir. You can't tell them. It will tear the village apart. We can't undo what we did. We can't bring Ahmed back. And if you expose the truth, there will be no going back. Amir looked at the old man, his expression hardening. The truth always finds a way out. And I will make sure it is heard. As he turned and walked away from the elders, Amir felt a sense of finality settle over him. The truth was out there now. And there was no going back. The village would have to face what they had done, whether they were ready or not. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a sense of inevitability. It was no longer a question of whether Amir would reveal the truth to the villagers, it was a question of when. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that the village was built on lies so deep that even the oldest trees seemed to tremble at the thought of them being unearthed. Amir could feel the weight of the secret pressing down on him. He had never intended to uncover something so dark, so sinister. But now that he knew, there was no turning back. The truth had a way of consuming those who sought it, leaving nothing untouched in its wake. The villagers were still in denial. They didn't want to face what had happened. They wanted to live in peace, to believe that the fire had been a tragic accident. But Amir couldn't let them live in ignorance any longer. He had to tell them, even if it meant tearing the village apart. It was late afternoon when Amir returned to the village square. The air was thick with tension, as if the very earth itself was holding its breath. The elders had been quiet since their conversation. They had offered no resistance, but Amir knew they were plotting something. They couldn't afford for the truth to come out, especially not now. Amir had never been more certain of anything in his life. He had to confront the villagers, to bring the truth to the surface. They needed to understand the consequences of their actions, even if it meant destroying the fragile peace they had tried so hard to build. As he approached the square, he could see the familiar faces of the villagers gathered in small groups, talking in hushed tones. They looked up when they saw him, their expressions hardening. Word had already spread that Amir had been digging into the past, that he was asking questions no one dared to answer. It was Ibrahim who saw him first, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Amir had no illusions. Ibrahim knew what was coming. They all did. "I see you've made your decision," Ibrahim said as Amir walked toward him. Amir met his gaze without flinching. "I'm going to tell them. They deserve to know the truth." Ibrahim's face darkened. "You don't understand, Amir. The village has lived with this secret for decades. What good will it do to expose it now?" Amir shook his head. "What good will it do to keep it hidden? The past doesn't stay buried forever, Ibrahim. You can't protect them by keeping it quiet." The elder's lips pressed into a tight line. He knew Amir was right. But it was clear that he would do anything to prevent the truth from coming out. "I'm warning you," Ibrahim said, his voice low and threatening. "If you expose the truth, there will be consequences. The villagers will never forgive you." But Amir was undeterred. He had already made up his mind. He could already hear the whispers of the villagers, their voices carrying through the air like the ghosts of a past long buried. "I'm not afraid of consequences," Amir said, his voice steady. "The truth is more important than anything else." With that, he turned and walked away, heading toward the center of the village square. The air seemed to grow heavier with every step, as if the village itself were trying to stop him. The villagers parted as he walked, their eyes following him like a sea of silent judgment. Amir reached the center of the square, where the village bell stood, its heavy iron frame casting a shadow over the crowd. He climbed the small stone steps that led to the bell, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the moment, the pressure building as he prepared to speak. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the square. "Villagers of this land," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "There is something you need to know, something that has been kept from you for far too long." The villagers fell silent, their eyes locked on him. Some looked confused, others anxious. They had never seen Amir like this before. The teacher, the man they had once trusted, was now a stranger to them. Amir took a deep breath. "Years ago, this village suffered a terrible tragedy. A fire that destroyed part of our home, claimed the lives of many, and changed everything. But what you don't know, the truth that has been hidden from you, is that the fire was no accident." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The faces of the villagers twisted in disbelief. They had always been told that the fire had been a result of a lightning strike, a freak accident. But now, Amir was telling them that it was something much darker. "The fire was set deliberately," Amir continued, his voice rising with the weight of his words. "It was an act of betrayal, an act of desperation. A group of our own made a deal with outsiders, a deal that required a terrible sacrifice. They offered up one of our own children in exchange for prosperity." Gasps echoed through the square. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, unsure if they had heard correctly. Some began to shuffle uncomfortably, others looked away, unwilling to confront the truth. Amir's eyes scanned the crowd, locking onto the familiar faces that he had known his whole life. The child who was sacrificed was Ahmed. He was only 5 years old. He did not run away. He was taken, given up in exchange for something we never should have agreed to. A hushed silence fell over the square. The shock was palpable. Amir could feel the weight of the words settling in the hearts of those listening. The betrayal, the loss, the horror of what had really happened all those years ago, it was too much for some to bear. The villagers remained still, as if they were frozen in place, their minds struggling to comprehend what Amir had just revealed. But it was Fatima who broke the silence, her voice trembling as she spoke up. "Why?" she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. "Why would they do such a thing? How could they betray us all like that?" Amir turned to face her, his expression softening. They were desperate. The village was dying. The crops failed, the rain stopped. They believed they had no choice. But they were wrong. And now, the truth has to come out. We cannot continue living in the shadow of this lie. Fatima wiped her eyes, her hands shaking. But the elders, they were the ones who made the deal. They were the ones who betrayed us. Amir nodded slowly. Yes. The elders were the ones who made the pact with the outsiders. But they were not the only ones involved. Many others in this village knew about it, and they chose to keep silent. They chose to protect themselves rather than protect the truth. The villagers shifted uneasily, their faces a mixture of guilt, fear, and disbelief. Some looked away, unable to meet Amir's gaze. Others stood frozen, their hands clenched into fists at their sides. The truth was like a wound that refused to heal, it bled out, raw and painful, and no one could escape it. "We've lived with this for too long," Amir said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We cannot undo what has been done, but we can make sure that this never happens again. We have to face the past, no matter how painful it is, so that we can rebuild." But there were others who did not share his conviction. A loud voice rang out from the crowd, one filled with anger. "You're a traitor," someone shouted. "You've torn apart our village. You've shattered everything we've built." The accusation hung in the air, thick with resentment. It was a voice Amir knew well, Abdul, a man who had always been fiercely loyal to the elders. He had spent his life defending the village, and now he saw Amir's actions as a betrayal of everything they had fought to protect. Amir turned to face him, his eyes cold. "I'm not the traitor, Abdul. I'm just telling the truth. And sometimes, the truth is the hardest thing to accept." Abdul's face twisted with fury. "The truth? You've ruined us. You've turned us against each other." Amir's heart clenched as he realized the cost of his decision. The village was tearing itself apart before his eyes. But he couldn't back down now. He had come this far, and the truth had already been set in motion. There was no turning back. "I did not ruin this village," Amir said, his voice firm. "The ones who made the deal with the outsiders, they ruined it. They betrayed us all. And now, we must face the consequences." As the words left his mouth, he knew that the village would never be the same again. The lie had been exposed, and the truth was like a storm tearing through the village, leaving destruction in its wake. But at least, for the first time in years, the villagers could see clearly. They could no longer hide from what had been done. The village had always been a place of simplicity, where everyone knew everyone else, and the bonds of community were held together by generations of shared history. That history, however, had been built on lies. And now, that foundation was crumbling. Amir's heart was heavy as he walked through the village in the hours after the revelation. He could still hear the voices of the villagers echoing in his mind, some angry, some fearful, others simply numb. The quiet after the storm was deafening. He had expected anger, but he hadn't anticipated the deep, paralyzing fear that now gripped everyone. Fear of the truth. Fear of what the future would bring. His decision to expose the truth had caused a rift. The village was divided, some believed in Amir's right to reveal the past, while others saw him as a traitor. Abdul had already begun rallying those who refused to believe the horrors of the past. The elders, though silent for now, wore expressions of quiet regret and something more, fear. As Amir walked down the village's dirt path, he couldn't help but notice the difference in the atmosphere. The once bustling streets were now eerily quiet. People avoided eye contact, and there was an unmistakable tension in the air. The unity the village had once enjoyed was shattered, replaced by distrust and a simmering resentment. Amir had hoped that by revealing the truth, the village could begin healing. But it seemed that the scars were too deep, the wounds too raw. The truth had done its job, it had exposed the darkness hiding beneath the surface, but it had also torn apart everything the villagers had once believed in. There was no going back. Fatima had been the only one to stand by him. Her support was unwavering, but even she was shaken. As she approached him that evening, Amir could see the concern in her eyes. The light that had once sparkled in her gaze was now dimmed by the weight of everything they had uncovered. "Amir, are you sure you did the right thing?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Amir turned to her, his eyes filled with resolve. "It's the only thing I could do, Fatima. The truth needed to be told. We can't live in the shadow of a lie forever." Fatima nodded, but there was a lingering sadness in her eyes. "I know. But now everything feels so uncertain. I don't know how we move forward from here." Amir sighed deeply. "I don't know either. But we have to try. The villagers deserve to know the truth, even if they don't want to hear it." The air between them felt heavy with unspoken words. Amir could sense her fear, the same fear that gripped the hearts of the villagers. They were all standing at the precipice, unsure of what lay ahead. The following days were a blur. The village was on edge, and the once strong sense of community had disintegrated into chaos. The elders remained silent, perhaps hoping that the storm would pass and things would return to normal. But the truth was like a fire, it spread quickly, and it couldn't be contained. And as the fire spread, the cracks began to show. One afternoon, as Amir sat in the village square, he overheard a conversation between two women, their voices laced with fear and suspicion. "Did you hear?" one woman whispered, glancing around nervously. "They say Amir's been talking to the outsiders. Some say he's even trying to make a deal with them." Amir's heart sank. He had never spoken to the outsiders since the day he uncovered the truth, and the mere suggestion that he had been involved with them was a blatant lie. But it didn't matter. The rumors were already taking root. The lies had started to spread like wildfire, just as the truth had. And the more the rumors spread, the more the villagers turned against him. He became the villain, the outsider, the one who had betrayed them all. They couldn't see beyond the surface of his actions, they couldn't understand the motivation behind his decisions. They saw only the consequences. Amir's chest tightened as the whispers grew louder, the fear turning into hatred. He knew what was coming. It was only a matter of time before the village would demand retribution, and they wouldn't care about the truth. That night, he was woken by a knock on his door. It was Fatima, her face pale and streaked with tears. "They're coming for you, Amir," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They want to hurt you. They say you've destroyed everything." Amir's mind raced. The village had turned on him. The people he had known his whole life were now his accusers. They saw him as the source of their misery, the one who had forced them to face the darkness of their past. They didn't see the burden of the truth, they only saw the destruction it had caused. "I have to leave," Amir said, his voice steady despite the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. "They won't stop until they've made me a scapegoat. I've already caused enough damage." Fatima shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "You can't just leave. We can fix this. We can make them understand." Amir placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "No, Fatima. I can't fix this. The truth was never meant to be easy. But it's too late now. The damage is done. The village will never be the same." Fatima tried to argue, but she knew he was right. There was no going back. The village had crossed a line, and Amir was no longer one of them. He was an outsider, someone who had dared to expose the truth and, in doing so, had torn apart everything they had built. The next morning, Amir packed his things, leaving the small room he had stayed in for months. He knew it would be the last time he would ever step foot in the village. The weight of his decision was heavy on his shoulders, but he couldn't stay. The villagers would never forgive him. They would never accept the truth. As he walked through the village for the final time, he saw the familiar faces, faces that once greeted him with warmth now filled with suspicion. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional mutter of condemnation. Abdul stood in the village square, flanked by several others, his face twisted in anger. "You're a coward, Amir," he shouted, his voice carrying across the square. "You've torn this village apart with your lies. You've ruined us." Amir stopped, his heart aching as he looked at the man who had once been a friend. "I didn't ruin anything, Abdul. I only gave you the truth. It's the truth that has ruined everything." The anger in Abdul's eyes was replaced with something darker, fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of the future that no one could predict now that the truth had been exposed. "You've destroyed us," Abdul repeated, his voice trembling. "And you'll never be welcome here again." With that, Amir turned and continued walking, the sound of his footsteps the only thing that filled the air. He was leaving the village behind, but the village would never leave him. The truth had changed everything, and there was no going back. As he left the village, Amir couldn't help but feel a strange sense of finality. He had made his choice. He had done what he believed was right. But in the end, the price of truth was higher than he had ever imagined. The village had paid the price, too. The journey that Amir had begun months ago, unknowingly, had now come full circle. W. had started as a search for the truth had turned into a battle of survival, not just for himself, but for everything the village had stood for. Amir had thought that revealing the truth would liberate the villagers, bring them closer to healing. But now, in the desolate silence of his departure, he understood just how naive that belief had been. As he walked through the forest, leaving behind the village that had once felt like home, Amir's mind raced. The sounds of the birds, the rustling of the trees, the steady thrum of his heartbeat, these were all he could focus on. Everything else felt distant. His body had been carrying the weight of the village's judgment, but it was his mind that had truly been fractured. He was an outcast. No one from the village would look him in the eye again. The village that had once rallied together now lay in fragments. The truth had shattered everything, family bonds, friendships, and a whole way of life. Amir could still hear Abdul's words echoing in his mind, "You've ruined us." They had hit harder than anything else. In his heart, Amir knew he had done what was right, but the sting of rejection from those he had known his entire life was something that couldn't be undone. But the village wasn't the only thing that had changed. Amir had, too. He had set out to find a truth that would restore his purpose, to bring light to the darkness the villagers had lived in for years. But now, the light felt blinding. It had exposed more than just the past, it had exposed Amir's own weaknesses, his inability to control what happened once the truth was set free. Fatima's face lingered in his mind, too. She had tried so hard to keep him grounded, to help him see the bigger picture. She had loved him, he knew that, even now. And yet, she was gone. The last time they spoke, she had begged him not to leave, to stay and help fix what had been broken. But Amir had seen the fear in her eyes, the helplessness. He had realized that the village couldn't be fixed, not by him. Not by anyone. Amir stopped walking and sat by a small stream, the cool water gurgling gently over the rocks. The solitude of nature was the only thing that brought him any peace. He had been running for too long, running from the consequences of his actions, but now he had to stop and face the reality. How had it come to this? He had always believed that the truth was the ultimate weapon, that by exposing the darkness, the light would shine through. But all he had done was unearth something far more dangerous, something that could never be swept back into the shadows. The realization hit him like a wave, truth was not always about what was right. Sometimes, it was about what was needed, what could actually bring healing. Had he made a mistake? Had he been so focused on what needed to be revealed that he failed to consider the consequences? The days that followed were a blur of confusion and uncertainty. Amir had left the village behind, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still bound to it. He couldn't outrun the memories, the faces, the voices of the people he had once cared for. One night, after several days of wandering, Amir found himself standing on the outskirts of another village. This place was quieter, its streets empty in the late hours of the evening. His feet were sore, his mind tired from the endless questions that refused to leave him. He was about to turn away when a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was an older man, dressed in simple clothes, his face weathered by years of experience. His eyes were kind but sharp, and when he looked at Amir, there was no judgment, only understanding. "You look lost, my friend," the old man said, his voice soft but firm. "What brings you here?" Amir didn't know why, but something about the stranger's presence made him feel at ease. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days, and the isolation was beginning to eat at him. "I don't know why I'm here," Amir confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could help, but now, I don't even know what I've done." The old man nodded as if he understood exactly what Amir was feeling. He gestured for him to sit on a nearby bench. "You've done something powerful, young man. Something very few people can do." Amir sat, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I don't feel powerful. I feel like I've destroyed everything." The old man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Destruction isn't always the end. Sometimes it's just the beginning. You've revealed a truth, yes. But what you don't understand is that truth is a seed. It doesn't grow immediately, and it doesn't always bear fruit in the way you expect. But it will grow, in time." Amir's eyes narrowed in confusion. "How can you say that? You don't know what I've done. The village, they hate me. They won't ever forgive me." The old man smiled gently. "Forgiveness isn't something that comes immediately. It's a journey, just like everything else. You cannot control how others respond. But you can control how you move forward." Amir fell silent, contemplating the old man's words. He had been so focused on the village's reaction, on the anger and rejection that came with revealing the truth, that he had never stopped to think about his own healing. "You're right," Amir said softly. "I've been running from my own choices. From the consequences." The old man nodded, his eyes knowing. "We all run from the consequences, at first. But running only brings temporary relief. In the end, we must face what we've done, and accept it. Only then can we truly move forward." Amir felt a heavy weight lift from his chest, as though the burden of guilt he had carried for so long was finally beginning to ease. He wasn't sure how the villagers would respond or if they would ever truly forgive him. But he knew one thing: he had to forgive himself first. The following morning, Amir left the small village where he had spent the night. The old man's words echoed in his mind as he continued his journey. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. Meanwhile, back in the village, the aftermath of the truth was beginning to unravel. The villagers had been divided, yes, but they were also starting to recognize the weight of what they had done. The elders, especially, began to question their own actions. They had buried the truth for so long, convinced that keeping it hidden was the only way to protect the community. But now, they could see the damage that had been done, not just to Amir, but to the village itself. In the weeks that followed, some began to reach out to Amir. Fatima, though she had been heartbroken by his departure, sent him a letter, an apology, and a promise that she would try to help the village heal. She had seen the depth of his sacrifice, and she knew that he had acted from a place of love, not malice. Abdul, too, had started to change. He no longer saw Amir as a traitor, but as someone who had brought the village face to face with its own sins. There was still anger, still hurt, but it was tempered with a growing understanding of the complexity of the situation. But Amir was not there to witness it. He had made his peace. He had learned that truth, while painful, was not the enemy, it was a necessary force for growth. As he journeyed into the unknown, he carried with him the lesson that sometimes, the most